Good evening, Professor Clark and class. My name is Benjamin Smith, and this is my presentation on my favorite book of the Old Testament, the Book of Daniel. Let's get started with the overview. As with all presenters and presentations, they tell you what they're going to talk about, then tell you the content covered, and then just pretty much tell you what they just told you. I can't avoid it. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. So, without further ado, I'm going to be talking about the dating of Daniel's book. If he actually wrote it or not, or if there was two Daniels. The type of literature, if it's apocalyptic or prophetical. The purpose of his book. Some common themes found within. And then academic debates and issues, which you'll see three, but they really just tie into one. And how the Book of Daniel can have religious use and application in today's society, as well as a summary. Let's begin by the dating of Daniel. The origin of Daniel. Most scholars feel and believe that it's the 2nd century. However, there's argument to state that it's 2nd century because of the language contained therein. It seems like there's two Daniels that wrote the book. Verizon states that the location of the text among the writings in the Masoretic tradition is due to the fact that it represents the youngest book of the Old Testament. However, De Tomaso states the formation of the Masoretic tradition of Daniel and the acceptance of parts or the whole of it as authoritative initiated the process whereby it and its translations were eventually considered canonical. More importantly, the authoritative status of the biblical book established the conditions under which the later Daniel material could have been judged substantively and conceptually apocryphal. Price views it as since the discovery a few years ago of a Hebrew fragment of Ecclesiasticus dating from 2nd century BC, written in classical Hebrew, the argument from form of the language has little weight for either. So there's arguments for either way. Could it be 2nd or 6th? Most scholars lean towards 6th. However, it is questionable. And they are divided as to when the Book of Daniel actually came about. Because some can view it as the composition of the book in the Babylonian exile, and some date the composition of the book from the Maccabean era, and those who see the middle ground. But there's really no argument to state that whether or not there were two Daniels. So the more they lean to is the 2nd century where Daniel wrote the book. Now how about the literature? This will prove his authorship. Is it apocalyptic, prophetical, or both? Price states Daniel as a book possesses characteristics. It is not a transcript of any other prophet. If we are unwilling to admit the existence of predictive prophecy in Daniel, then of course, the visions he experienced are best explained when located in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. The Book of Daniel is actually both, as is termed, apocalyptic prophecy. His purpose, Daniel differed from every other prophet that has come to serve the Lord. Usually, the prophets prophesied doom and gloom and destruction, but God had different plans for him. He ordered his proclamations and unveilings to usher hope to the exilic people of Israel. There are a few common themes found within the Book of Daniel. A prominent and central one is the temple of God. Goswell states the Book of Daniel opens with the taking of the temple vessels by Nebuchadnezzar and their transportation to Babylon. Their later sacrilegious use by Belshazzar is described in chapter 5. In chapter 8, the little horn, which we come to know as Antiochus, stops the Jews worshiping their God and overthrows the sanctuary. But then God's sanctuary is restored. The prayer recorded in Daniel 9 complains of the desolate state of the sanctuary and contains earnest prayer for its restoration, and the sanctuary is still the focus of the angelic revelation in chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. He continues that both halves of the Book of Daniel, the main challenge of God's kingship within history, takes the form of foreign profaning of the temple. Such interference with the temple is a direct challenge to God's rule and appears to call into question the reality of his rule. Another common theme is wisdom. Wisdom is a prominent thing within Daniel. One can see when reading the text that Daniel continued to follow the law, and God blessed him with unparalleled wisdom during his time in exile, as well as through multiple rulers. However, probably the most important that should be noted is God's sovereignty and his dealing with his chosen people as well as the rest of mankind. In Daniel, God again and again manifested his power through miracles pertaining to Daniel, as well as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which are better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As you know, with the fiery furnace, as well as Daniel in the lion's den, God shut the mouths of the lions so Daniel could be saved. Through the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were spared from the fiery furnace. He walked among them. There was no way man could overthrow God's plan. But we can always throw debates into the mix. As in the authorship of Daniel, the historical accuracy, whether it's 6th or 2nd century, and whether or not it was really apocalyptic. But all these can tie into one argument. The reason for debate about authorship is because of the difference in some forms of the text. Some versions of Daniel contain all three of the languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. However, most discovered texts contain just Hebrew and Aramaic. Price notes that in the veiled form of a revelation of the future in chapter 11 gives an outline of a history from the time of Cyrus to near the death of Antiochus. The unity of authorship has been the prevailing view among all scholars of all books. The conclusion that chapters 7 through 12 belong to the age of Antiochus Epiphanes appears warranted. And then also chapters 1 through 6, if by the same author. Now, how does it apply today? Daniel, the book of Daniel, constantly displays the mercy of God to his people, as well as his chosen servant Daniel. Daniel portrays the trials of how a person who follows God's law can overcome every obstacle presented to him, even when all hope seems lost. God never abandons his children. And I have just scratched the surface of a magnificent work that is known as Book of Daniel. I talked about the dating of his authorship, that it is apocalyptic prophecy, his purpose, which is ultimately the sovereignty of God being challenged, the common themes of the temple, wisdom, as well as God's sovereignty. Really just one academic debate, and how religious use and it can be applied in today's society. Here's my works cited page, as well as the next two slides. This concludes my presentation of the Book of Daniel. I hope you enjoyed learning from it as I have researching it. Thank you.